There is a building in Amsterdam that no longer exists. For 2 centuries, it stood as the nervous system of global commerce, a columned hall with the open courtyard where men in long coats circled one another, calling out prices in accented voices, their hands making rapid gestures that moved vast fortunes across oceans and continents. In this space, on ordinary August afternoons in 1602, ordinary Dutch citizens, a baker, a widow, a schoolteacher, purchased small certificates of ownership in a company that did not yet own so much as a single ship on the Indian Ocean. What they were doing had no name. There was no template for it. They were inventing modern finance. Over the next 200 years, this company and the market that grew around it would weave nearly every continent into a single, glittering, brutally profitable network. The company was called the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC by its Dutch initials. It was chartered in 1602 and remained profitable for an astonishing 197 years. It employed over 1 million people across 3 continents at its height. It sponsored scientific expeditions, founded cities, waged wars, and distributed dividends to its shareholders with such reliability that it became the model for every large corporation that would follow. It also committed atrocities that emptied entire islands of their inhabitants. This is the story of how a small, water-bound nation built the infrastructure of global capitalism and what the world inherited when that company finally collapsed. In the early 1600s, the Dutch were not supposed to be merchants of the world. They were herring fishers, dike builders, and millers, a people whose entire civilization rested on the premise that they could tame water. The Dutch Republic was only 30 years old, born from a rebellion against Spanish rule that had consumed an entire generation of warfare. When you looked at the map, the Netherlands did not appear to be the place from which a global empire would emerge. Much of the country lay below sea level, a patchwork of lakes and marshes that successive generations had converted to dry land through relentless engineering. Grinding mills that moved water into canals, dikes that held back the sea's constant pressure, hydraulic systems of such sophistication that foreign visitors arrived wondering whether they had witnessed human ingenuity or delusion. The herring fishery had been the foundation of Dutch survival and prosperity for centuries. In the early 600s, Dutch fishermen controlled the North Sea, operating fleets of herring boats that would depart each spring and return laden with catch that would be salted and preserved in the holds of warehouses in Amsterdam and other northern cities. The salting process was crucial. Herring preserved in salt could survive the journey across land routes and could be stored for months or even years without spoiling. This single fact that herring could be preserved and therefore transported had made the Dutch wealthy. The innovation of the herring bus, a specialized fishing vessel designed to both catch and partially process the herring at sea, had revolutionized the industry. A single bus could land 30 tons of herring in a season, and the Dutch owned hundreds of these vessels. The fish were gutted and salted aboard ship, then packed into wooden barrels that were transported to Amsterdam, to Baltic ports, to Mediterranean cities. Herring had become currency, the foundation upon which Dutch commerce rested. By 1602, this wet, beleaguered nation had something unexpected: genuine money. The herring wealth had created a class of merchant princes in Amsterdam, wealthy men who had invested their profits from fish into other ventures. They financed expeditions to Russia, to the Mediterranean, to the distant Baltic. They loaned money to kingdoms. They established trading companies that operated across northern Europe. But herring wealth was regional wealth, a northern European affair. To the south and east, Portuguese merchants commanded something far more lucrative. They had found their way to the Indies, to the islands where pepper and cloves and nutmeg grew, where cinnamon bark could be peeled from living trees, where these substances commanded prices that made herring look like common salt. A single pound of nutmeg was worth its weight in silver. A clove was literally currency. The Portuguese had arrived first, around 1500, and had established factories and forts and trading posts across what is now Indonesia and the southern coast of India. The process had taken generations, but slowly and methodically, the Portuguese had built a monopoly on the spice trade that generated revenues so large they could fund kingdoms. Portuguese ships would depart Lisbon laden with European goods, wine, cloth, metalwork, and return with holds full of cloves and nutmeg and pepper that would be sold throughout Europe at prices that seemed almost incomprehensible. The profits went to merchants, to shipowners, to the Portuguese crown, which taxed every spice transaction. The wealth flowed northward to Lisbon, to the royal treasury, to the merchants' houses, and seemed to have no end. The Dutch, watching this wealth flow southward and then accumulate in Lisbon, understood a simple truth. If they could reach those islands themselves, if they could break the Portuguese monopoly, the herring trade would seem a minor enterprise. But the Portuguese had military superiority, distance, and entrenched power. To challenge them would require an operation of unprecedented scale and risk. Amsterdam, in 1602, was a city of narrow streets and sudden wealth, where timber from the forests of the Baltic was being converted into ships, where rope makers worked night shifts, braiding hemp from local flax, where tar smell and timber smell hung over the wharves like a permanent fog. The city had already learned to finance risky ventures through partnerships and insurance schemes. Merchants who sent a single ship to the Mediterranean would syndicate the risk, dividing ownership among 10 or 20 partners, so that if the ship sank, no single person was ruined. This practice of distributing risk had existed for centuries in Italian and Mediterranean trading cities, but the Dutch had refined it into an almost scientific art. They understood that risk could be quantified and priced like cutco cargo. A merchant could purchase a share of insurance on a single ship's voyage for a small percentage of the value, and if the ship was lost, the insurance pool would cover the loss. If the ship returned safely, the merchant lost the insurance premium. But the calculation was sound. The long-term odds favored a mixed portfolio of insured and uninsured voyages. This system had evolved from maritime practice into a financial discipline. The polder system, the reclamation of land from water through organized engineering, had also taught the Dutch something else: that capital, organization, and engineering could accomplish things that seemed impossible. A polder required careful financial planning, coordination among investors and landowners, collective management of complex machinery, and a long-term commitment to maintenance. A successful polder project could generate returns for decades. The skills required to organize a polder, aggregating small investors, managing complex projects, maintaining institutions over time, were the same skills that would be required to mount an expedition to the Indies. The stage was set for what would come next. Someone would realize that the mechanism for financing polders, distributing ownership, pooling capital, managing risk through collective structures, could be scaled to the greatest venture yet attempted. Someone would create an institution so large and so permanent that it could challenge the Portuguese, mount expeditions to the Indies, plant flags on foreign shores, establish fortifications and trade relationships, and return to Amsterdam with holds full of pepper and nutmeg and the promise of dividends that would make every investor wealthy. That moment was approaching. The herring fleets were already pushing north, already searching for new waters to exploit. The polder engineers were already imagining what could be accomplished with unlimited capital. And in the merchant houses of Amsterdam and the counting rooms of rival cities, the mathematics of the spice trade were being calculated by men who understood that monopoly control of those waters would be worth any investment, any risk. To understand why the Dutch were willing to invest their herring wealth in such a risky enterprise, you have to understand the economics of spices. In early modern Europe, spices were not luxury seasonings. They were something closer to currency, closer to a medicine, closer to a controlled drug. A small amount of nutmeg could preserve meat for months longer than salt alone could preserve it. Cloves could mask the taste of spoiled food. Pepper could cover the flavor of nearly anything. In a Europe without refrigeration, where winter meant months of eating salt-cured meat and stored vegetables, so long spodum some cured beneath trams by estiger, spices were the difference between nutrition and scurvy, between food that was merely edible and food that a wealthy person might actually enjoy. They were also believed to have medicinal properties, and in an age before modern medicine, belief in efficacy was often enough. A wealthy merchant or a nobleman's wife would purchase small quantities of nutmeg or cinnamon from an apothecary, and the prices were such that a single ounce might cost a day's wages for a labourer. In the early 600s, a pound of cloves might sell in Amsterdam for 30 guilders, when a skilled worker earned perhaps 300 guilders per year. A pound of nutmeg was worth roughly the same. Imagine, then, a commodity so rare and so costly that a shipload of it could cook an inch food and could make an entire voyage profitable even if the ship was only 1/3 full. Imagine cargo that did not spoil, that did not deteriorate, that could wait years in a warehouse for the price to rise even higher. This was the mathematics of the spice trade. The Portuguese had understood this perfectly. They had fought their way to the Indies around 1500, had built fortified trading posts, and had gradually expelled Arab and Indian merchants who had been trading the Spice Islands for centuries. But the Portuguese expansion had not been a swift conquest. It had taken decades of naval warfare, negotiation, and gradual establishment of bases to build their monopoly. They had established trading posts in places like Goa on the Indian coast, in Malacca, controlling the strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and in the Moluccas, closer to the Spice Islands themselves. They had maintained a fleet of armed ships to protect their trade routes from rival merchants and opportunistic pirates. A Portuguese ship that successfully completed the voyage would be worth more than a small estate. The Portuguese were the masters of a vast network that stretched from Europe around the Cape of Good Hope to India to Southeast Asia to Japan. The route was long, a journey that could take 10 or 12 months depending on winds and weather, but the profits at the end justified the risk. By 1595, the Portuguese controlled the spice trade almost completely. But control was not the same as monopoly. Arab merchants still smuggled spices through the Red Sea, taking the overland route across Egypt. Indian princes still traded with anyone they could, hedging their bets against the future. But the Portuguese had the military advantage, the fortified position, and most importantly, they had arrived at the moment when European demand for spices was at its highest. Prices were extraordinary. A Portuguese ship arriving in Lisbon with a hold full of cloves or nutmeg could generate revenues equal to a small kingdom's annual tax receipt. The Portuguese crown took a percentage of every shipload. The crown's share was about a fifth of the cargo value. The merchants and shipowners took their percentages. The crew received their wages. And yet, there was still such tremendous profit that even after all these layers of extraction, a Portuguese merchant could become wealthy beyond anything a herring trader could imagine. Fortunes flowed through Lisbon like the Tagus River flowing to the Atlantic. The spice houses of Lisbon became legendary, filled with treasures that spoke of distant land. Foreign merchants and dignitaries visited Lisbon just to see the warehouses, the quantities of spice, the visible manifestation of wealth. The Dutch merchants of Amsterdam watched this wealth accumulate, understood the mathematics perfectly, and understood also that the Portuguese monopoly was not unbreakable. The Portuguese had only a small number of ships, perhaps 50 active ocean-going vessels at any moment. They had to return annually through waters that sometimes offered opportunities for interception. They had built fortifications, but fortifications could be challenged. And most importantly, the Portuguese were just one nation, one navy, one mercantile system, operating across an enormous geographic area from Lisbon to Nagasaki. The Dutch, fragmented into competing cities and merchant families, were potentially more flexible, more aggressive, more willing to take risks if the payoff was large enough. By 1595, the first Dutch expeditions were being organized, not by the government but by merchants pooling their resources in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and other trading cities. A fleet under the command of Cornelis de Houtman was prepared in Amsterdam. It was not large, 4 ships, perhaps 250 men, but it was an act of defiance against the Portuguese system. The voyage would take 8 months to cross the Indian Ocean and reach the Spice Islands, a journey through waters where few Dutch ships had ever sailed. If it succeeded, the spices brought back would command extraordinary prices in Amsterdam. If it failed, if the ships were lost or seized, if no cargo was brought back, the merchants who funded it would lose their investment. The voyage was also extraordinarily dangerous. Shipwrecks claimed vessels regularly. Diseases like scurvy would kill sailors far from home. Rival merchant ships or pirates might appear to seize the cargo. It was, by the standards of the time, an almost reckless venture. But the mathematics were compelling. One successful voyage could generate returns of 400% or higher. One successful voyage could make a man wealthy for life. A merchant could invest 1,000 guilders in outfitting a ship, and if the voyage succeeded, receive 4,000 guilders in return. No other venture offered such rewards. The herring trade was steady and reliable, but it would never generate the kind of wealth that the spice trade promised. A young merchant or an ambitious family would look at the Portuguese success and understand, this is where the money is. And if the Portuguese could do it, why not the Dutch? That question, asked repeatedly in Amsterdam's counting houses in the 1590s, would ultimately reshape the world. The first Dutch voyages to the Indies in 1595 and 1597 were successful. Cornelis de Houtman returned with pepper, cloves and nutmeg. Not a hold full, but enough. When the spices were sold in Amsterdam, the returns were extraordinary. The investors who had funded the voyage received their money back several times over. News of these returns spread through Amsterdam's merchant houses like a fever. Within a few years, multiple voyages were being organized by competing groups of merchants. Each city, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Middelburg, wanted to send its own expeditions. Each merchant family wanted a piece of the profits plus. By 1600, it became clear that competition was ruining everyone. Ships arriving in Amsterdam from the Indies were dumping spices onto the market faster than the market could absorb them, driving prices down. Merchant Tunap Correzen said it had invested in competing ventures was undercutting each other on prices. The system that had worked for the Portuguese, a single, unified monopoly that controlled supply and could therefore command high prices, was the only profitable way to manage the spice trade. Fragmented competition would destroy the wealth that the Dutch had discovered. In 1602, the States General of the Dutch Republic made a decision that would reshape the world, issued a charter to a new institution called the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, the United East India Company, known as the VOC. The charter was granted on March 20, 1602. It was not a simple business license. It was a grant of governmental power. The VOC was permitted to wage war, to make treaties, to establish forts and settlements, to appoint governors, to administer justice, and to maintain its own army and navy. In effect, the Dutch state was handing over an entire portion of global commerce to a private corporation and saying, do what you must to make the spice trade profitable, and we will take a cut. The monopoly was initially granted for 21 years, with the expectation that the charter could be renewed. The VOC was capitalized at approximately 6.4 million guilders, an enormous sum, perhaps equivalent to the annual tax revenue of the entire Dutch Republic. This capital was raised by selling shares to investors, not to wealthy merchants alone, but to anyone who could afford to purchase them. Here is where the VOC fundamentally departed from every commercial venture that had come before it. Earlier merchant companies had investors, certainly, but those investors typically could not withdraw their capital. They were locked into the venture. If you invested in a single voyage to the Indies, you received a share of the profits or losses from that voyage, but your money was tied up until the ship returned, a commitment of several years. The VOC was different. It issued permanent shares in the company itself, not in individual voyages. You could purchase a share in the VOC and hold it indefinitely, and crucially, this was the revolutionary part. You could sell that share to someone else. The shares were tradable. A merchant widow in Amsterdam could purchase a share in the VOC, hold it for 5 years, and then sell it to a younger merchant if she needed capital for another venture. She could sell it to a craftsman or a baker who wanted to invest their savings. This innovation, freely tradable shares in a perpetual institution, had no precedent. The concept of a corporation was not new, but the concept of a negotiable share of permanent stock was. Over 1,100 investors purchased shares in the initial offering in 1602. The list of investors survives and includes bakers, merchants, widows, clergy, and wealthy burgomasters. A maidservant named Hester Jansda invested 10 guilders, a modest amount that represented perhaps a week or two of her wages. A merchant named Kles Dierkes invested 3,000 guilders, a fortune. This was democratic capitalism in its infancy. Not everyone could afford to purchase shares. A laborer earning a few hundred guilders could not easily afford 1,000 guilders share, but enough people could afford them, even in small amounts, that the capital that had been hoarded in the hands of a few merchant princes was suddenly pooled from hundreds of ordinary citizens. A baker might invest 100 guilders alongside a nobleman's 1,000. A widow might invest a sum equal to the inheritance of her late husband. Together, these hundreds of ordinary investments created a capital base that no individual merchant could have assembled alone. The company established its governing structure around a council called the Heren 17, or the Gentlemen 17. These were representatives from the 6 chambers of the VOC: Amsterdam, Middelburg, Delft, Rotterdam, Enkhuizen, and Hoorn, each chamber representing a different trading city and each contributing to the overall governance of the company. The Amsterdam chamber was by far the most important, contributing roughly half the initial capital and having the largest voice in company decisions. This weighted system reflected economic reality. Amsterdam was the richest and most powerful of the trading cities. The Governor-General, who would rule the VOC's territory in Asia, reported to the Heren 17. The directors, who managed day-to-day operations in the various ports, reported to the chambers. On paper, it was a reasonable system of distributed oversight, allowing each region to have a voice, while centralizing strategic decisions. In practice, given the distance between Amsterdam and the Indies, 8 months of sailing each way, the Governor-General would acquire almost complete autonomy. He would write dispatches to Amsterdam explaining his decisions, and by the time the response arrived, he had often already committed the company to entirely new strategies. A decision made by the Governor-General in October might not be known in Amsterdam until June of the following year. By that time, the Governor-General had already made decisions that contradicted or superseded the position of the Home Office. The communication lag created a fundamental structural problem. The company was essentially governing itself from Asia as much as from Amsterdam. This would prove to be both the company's greatest strength and eventually a source of its decline. The VOC was born of compromise, of pooled capital, of shared risk among multiple cities and regions. But it was an institution designed to operate in a condition of permanent distance, permanent information lag, and permanent uncertainty. Its success would depend on finding leaders capable of operating in those conditions without losing sight of the core mission: generate profits for the shareholders. Everything else, morality, legality, relationships with local peoples, long-term sustainability, the welfare of employees, would be secondary to this objective. The Charter explicitly granted the company nearly all the powers of a state. It could mint coins, enter into treaties, wage war, establish settlements, and administer law in the territories it controlled. But those same authorities would be exercised at a distance by men who had no oversight, who could not be easily removed, and who had every incentive to maximize extraction from the territories under their control. For the shares to hold value, for investors to feel confident that their purchase was real and meaningful, a mechanism had to exist to allow them to sell those shares. In 1609, the Wissel Bank, or Bank of Amsterdam, was established. It was not a central bank in the modern sense, but it served a function that is now central bank-like. It standardized currency and credit. The bank accepted deposits in various foreign coins and scrip, and issued standardized notes denominated in a single currency. This solved a practical problem. Amsterdam's merchant community was drowning in currency fluctuations and counterfeits. A ship arriving from the Mediterranean might bring guilders, florins, ducats, Spanish reales, all of different weights and purities, all subject to fluctuation in value. A merchant receiving payment in Spanish coins had to worry about whether those coins were real or counterfeit, and about whether their value would remain stable. The bank eliminated this uncertainty. It created confidence that value was stable, that transactions could be verified, that the monetary system was trustworthy. A merchant could deposit a quantity of mixed foreign coins, and the bank would credit him with exactly measured guilders on deposit. Those guilders were backed by the physical coins held in the bank's vaults. This standardization was radical and immediately valuable to anyone buying or selling shares, because share prices could now be quoted in a stable currency. In 1611, the Bourse, the exchange, opened for trading. Henrik de Keyser, one of the most renowned architects of the age, designed a building specifically meant to facilitate the trading of shares and other financial instruments. The building was approximately 60 meters long and 35 meters wide. It had no roof over the central courtyard. Instead, 42 numbered columns were arranged in a square around an open-air floor. Traders and brokers would gather at specific columns and call out bids and asks. One trader would announce that he wished to sell 100 shares of the VOC at 30 guilders per share. Another would call out that he would purchase 50 at 30 guilders, but the remaining 50 would require 31 guilders. Prices were determined by supply and demand, by reputation, by news from returning ships, by rumors. If a ship was reported to have been lost off the Cape of Good Hope, the price of VOC shares would plummet. If a ship returned with an extraordinary cargo, the price would soar. The Dutch had created, perhaps without fully realizing it, the world's first stock market. The mechanics were simple: buyers and sellers meeting at a designated time and place, prices quoted in a standard currency, brokers facilitating the transactions, but the implications were revolutionary. Trading began almost immediately. The Bourse was organized by commodity. Certain columns were used for trading shares of the VOC, others for shares of the West India Company, which would be established in 1621, others for commodity trading, for insurance, for bills of exchange, but the VOC dominated the Bourse. It was the largest company, the most capital-intensive, the most profitable, and its shares were actively traded by hundreds of investors. A trader could purchase a share at the Bourse one day and sell it the next. Brokers emerged, men who specialized in matching buyers and sellers, who earned a small commission on each transaction. These brokers were some of the first financial professionals in the world, and the skills they developed, assessing value, reading market sentiment, understanding how information moved, would establish the template for traders and brokers for centuries to come. They learned to anticipate news, to understand the connections between a ship's departure date and future dividend payments, to sense when sentiment was shifting. On the Bourse, something else emerged that had not existed before: speculation. A merchant could purchase shares in the VOC without any intention of holding them, betting simply that the price would rise. He could buy a share for 30 guilders, hold it for 3 months while favorable news arrived from Asia, and sell it for 35 guilders, pocketing the 5 guilder gain. Or he could do the reverse. He could sell shares that he did not yet own, betting that the price would fall, so that he could purchase them at a lower price and deliver them to the buyer. This practice was called short selling, and it was pioneered by traders like Isaac Lemaire, a wealthy merchant who perfected the art of massive speculative short positions. Lemaire would coordinate with other traders to drive prices down, then purchase shares at the depressed prices, making enormous profits. It was immediately controversial. The authorities in Amsterdam saw short selling as destabilizing, as a kind of financial manipulation that violated the spirit of investing. But it was also profitable, and the people engaging in it were numerous and well-connected, so enforcement was sporadic and difficult. Some months, the city authorities would crack down on short sellers and attempt to ban the practice. Other times, enforcement would lapse as political alliances shifted. The practice persisted, and the people engaged in it became known as sophisticated traders who understood that profit could come from price movements rather than from actual cargo being unloaded at docks. The VOC company itself eventually moved to restrict some forms of short selling, but by then the practice was deeply embedded in the market structure. Over the course of several decades, a sophisticated financial market emerged at the Bourse. Prices were published in newspapers, market commentary appeared in pamphlets, trading volumes were tracked and reported. The wealth that the company generated was no longer just flowing back to merchants and traders, it was flowing to investors, ordinary people who had purchased shares and were now receiving dividends or selling shares at a profit. The dividend payments in particular were extraordinary. A VOC share purchased in 1602 for 3,000 guilders might receive 600 guilders in annual dividends, a 20% return year after year. There was nothing like this in the world. No government bond, no real estate lease, no other investment vehicle offered such consistent and generous returns. Shareholders had begun to experience the sensation that would later be called passive income. You purchased shares, held them, and money appeared regularly in your account. The mechanism had turned out to be entirely stable and profitable. The combination of the VOC's monopoly on the spice trade, the shareholders' incentive to maximize profits, and the market's ability to price shares efficiently had created a system that worked, or rather, it appeared to work, even if the appearance was sustained only by the steady flow of ships returning from the Indies laden with expensive spices and by the steady extraction of those profits from the territories that the VOC controlled in Asia. The Dutch had purchased control of the spice trade by charter and capital, but that charter only conferred a monopoly with the Dutch state. It did not confer monopoly with the world. The Portuguese were still present in the Indies, controlling a number of ports and islands. The English had begun mounting expeditions, and the Bandanese, the Moluccans, the Javanese, and other local populations had been trading spices for centuries before any European arrived. The notion that the VOC could simply declare a monopoly and have it respected was naive. It would have to be enforced, and enforcement required military power. The Banda Islands, small volcanic islands clustered in what is now eastern Indonesia, were the richest spice sources in the world. The islands themselves were tiny, the largest only about 50 square kilometers, yet they produced the most valuable crop on Earth. Nutmeg and mace grew there and nowhere else on the planet. A single nutmeg tree could produce 2 to 3 pounds of spices per year, and a hectare of Bandanese land could generate income that would take a European merchant years to accumulate. Some estimates suggest that a single Bandanese nutmeg tree could be worth more than a house in Amsterdam. The Bandanese had long conducted their own trade, selling to Arab merchants, to Indian merchants, to anyone who would purchase their spices. The wealth generated by this trade had made the island's rulers prosperous and independent. The Portuguese had tried to establish monopoly control and had partially succeeded, but control was incomplete and expensive. They maintained forts and demanded tributes, but the Bandanese continued to trade with merchants who were not Portuguese. The Dutch arrived with a new strategy and, gradually, with military force. By 1609, the VOC had begun to consolidate control over the Banda Islands, building forts and establishing regulations that forbade islanders from trading with anyone except the VOC. These regulations were not negotiated, they were imposed at gunpoint. By 1615, the VOC had established its primary Banda fortress on Nera Island and was attempting to enforce monopoly control. But enforcement required suppressing ongoing resistance. The local population objected to being locked into monopoly arrangements where they received perhaps 1/10 or 1/5 of the price that their spices commanded in Amsterdam. If a pound of nutmeg sold for 30 guilders in Amsterdam, a Bandanese producer might receive 3 guilders. The remaining profit went to the VOC. The arrangement was enormously profitable for the company and devastatingly impoverishing for the islanders. Resistance erupted, armed resistance in some cases, refusal to cooperate in others, attempts to smuggle spices out through rival traders. In 1621, under the command of Jan Pieterszoon Koon, who was the VOC's Governor-General in Asia, a decisive military action was undertaken. The term massacre is used by historians to describe what occurred. On May 8, 1621, Koon ordered the execution of 44 Bandanese leaders in a ceremony that was witnessed by the population of the islands as a demonstration of VOC power. Some sources indicate the executions were carried out in a particularly brutal manner designed to terrorize the population into submission. The bodies were displayed as warnings. Following the executions, Koon deported most of the remaining Bandanese population. Approximately 2,800 were killed and 170 were enslaved. The islands were emptied of their original inhabitants and repopulated with Dutch colonists, who established nutmeg plantations worked by imported slave labor, primarily from other parts of the Dutch East Indies and from regions where the VOC had established trading relationships. It was a genocide in the context of the VOC's business model. It was also a rational act from a purely economic perspective. The Bandanese had been resisting the monopoly, making threats against VOC officials, allying with competing merchants, generally undermining profitability. Koon's solution was to remove them and establish a system of production controlled entirely by Dutch settlers, who had no alternative to the VOC and no leverage to demand better treatment. The genocide was effective in economic terms. After 1621, the Banda Islands produced nutmeg almost entirely for the VOC. There were no independent producers, no competitors, no resistance, no indigenous population to negotiate with. The spices flowed to Batavia and then to Amsterdam with almost no friction. The shareholders received their dividends, the supply was completely controlled, the prices remained high. Koon himself was rewarded for his success with honors and authority. In a corporate structure designed solely to maximize shareholder returns, the system worked perfectly. The Molucca Islands to the north of the Banda Islands produced clothes. The VOC pursued a similar strategy, establishing monopoly control, suppressing local trade, eliminating sources of resistance. The process was slower and less violent than in the Banda Islands, but the logic was identical. Maximize production, minimize competition, enforce compliance through whatever means necessary. By the 1620s, the VOC effectively controlled the supply of nutmeg, mace and cloves entering European markets. Prices stabilized at remarkably high levels. Shareholders were content. The dividends continued. The VOC also used the same strategy in other regions, destroying spice trees in the Moluccas to maintain artificial scarcity and high prices, even though this meant burning crops that could have been harvested and sold. Better to have high prices and less supply from a profit perspective than lower prices and more supply. A tree that could not be controlled by the VOC was a threat. A tree that was cut down was a problem solved. But the human cost was buried in the administrative records of the company, in dispatches that describe pacification efforts and native labor arrangements in bureaucratic language that obscured what was actually happening. When these documents were later compiled into histories, they became sources of debate. Some historians emphasize that the VOC was operating within the norms of its time, that violence and coercion in colonial ventures were not unique to the Dutch. Others emphasize that this violence was chosen as a matter of policy, that alternatives existed, that the genocide in the Banda Islands was a deliberate act of commercial calculation. The truth is likely that both perspectives are valid. The VOC operated within the framework of its time, where military action and violence were accepted tools of statecraft and commerce. But within that framework, the VOC made specific choices. Cohen chose to empty the Banda Islands rather than attempt to manage or negotiate with the existing population. That choice was a choice, and it is impossible to separate it from the profit motive that drove the VOC. In 1619, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen established a new city on the coast of Java. He selected a location that had previously been occupied by a sultanate, conquered it, and founded what would become the capital of Dutch Asia. He named it Batavia, after an ancient Roman name for what is now the Netherlands. The city was built according to Dutch principles, with canals, the canals of Amsterdam, with fortress walls, with an administrative structure that replicated the governance of the motherland. The mother was land. It was a Dutch city, built on conquered land, established to serve the interests of the VOC. Cohen's vision was to create a fixed point in Asia, a permanent base of operations that would serve as the nerve center of Dutch commerce, the place where decisions were made, where cargo was received and distributed, where the great trading networks would converge. By 1620, Batavia had become the central hub of VOC operations in Asia. Ships arrived there from the Banda Islands laden with nutmeg. Ships arrived from the Moluccas laden with clothes. Other ships arrived from Persia with silk and wool. Still others arrived from Japan, from China, from India, from Siam, from ports across Southeast Asia. Batavia was not simply a spice entrepot, merely a warehouse where spices were stored before being shipped to Europe. It was the center of an intra-Asian trade network that was arguably more sophisticated and more profitable than the spice trade itself. The VOC had discovered that it could make enormous profits by trading within Asia, exploiting the economic geography of the region. A bolt of Indian cotton cloth could be purchased for 3 guilders in Calicut and sold for 10 guilders in Java. That same bolt could then be used to purchase clothes. The clothes purchased in Java for 10 guilders could be sold in Japan for 40 guilders. Japanese silver purchased with those 40 guilders could be shipped to India and sold for enough to purchase dozens of bolts of cloth again. The spices represented one stream of profit, but the intra-Asian trade represented multiple streams, each of them profitable, all of them feeding into a network that was centered on Batavia. The entire operation was coordinated by VOC officials sitting in offices in Batavia, calculating risks, routing ships, managing inventories. The city became one of the most cosmopolitan places in the world by the 1620s. Dutch merchants lived there alongside Chinese merchants, Persian merchants, Indian merchants, Arab merchants, and Javanese, who had adapted to the new political order. There were taverns and trading houses, mosques and Dutch churches, a fortress and warehouses, and the administrative buildings of the VOC. The city's harbour was crowded with ships from every part of the known world. The city's streets were chaotic and multilingual. You could hear Dutch, Chinese, Malay, Portuguese, Arabic, Japanese, Hindi, and a dozen other languages in the course of a single day. The city's population grew from perhaps 10,000 in 1620 to over 100,000 by the late 1600s. It was chaotic and wealthy and dangerous. Disease was endemic due to the tropical climate and the crowding and the sanitation systems that were barely adequate for the population. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical fevers killed thousands of residents each year. Yet wealth flowed through the city constantly. A merchant could arrive poor and depart wealthy. A laborer could earn wages that he could never earn in Europe. A soldier could serve for a few years and return home with accumulated savings that made him prosperous by European standards, if he survived the diseases and the dangers. The VOC Governor-General in Batavia held power that was almost absolute within his domain. He reported to the Heren 17 in Amsterdam, but the distance was so vast and communication so slow that he could make decisions with almost no oversight. 8 months of sailing time each way meant that a decision made in Batavia would be reported to Amsterdam, and the response would arrive 9 or 10 months later. By that time, the Governor-General had often already acted on his decision and moved on to other matters. He appointed subordinates, authorized military expeditions, negotiated treaties with local rulers, and made judgments about how to allocate company resources. Some governors-general were competent, concise, and others were corrupt, using their position to enrich themselves. The company's structure provided no mechanism to prevent corruption effectively. The records of the VOC are filled with references to officials who had accumulated wealth for their own account while supposedly serving the company. Cohen himself was wealthy, accumulating a fortune that extended beyond his salary. But Cohen was also extraordinarily effective in expanding VOC territory and consolidating VOC power. By the time he died in 1620, the VOC controlled ports and territories across a vast swathe of Asia, from Persia to Japan. The network of trade that centered on Batavia was so profitable that the dividends being paid to shareholders in Amsterdam continued to increase year after year. The company was printing money, or more precisely, its shareholders were receiving shares of profits that came from the control of trade networks and the systematic extraction of resources from conquered territories and subjugated peoples. The warehouses of Batavia were cavernous spaces that held inventory, spices waiting for the right moment to ship to Amsterdam, cloth purchased in India, porcelain from China, silver coins, pepper, and 1,000 other goods. The smell in the warehouses, according to contemporary accounts, was overwhelming. Spices, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, had an aroma that was lovely in small quantities but became almost oppressive in the massive quantities stored in Batavia. The spice smell would hang in the air for days after entering a warehouse, would cling to clothing and hair. Mixed with the smell of tar, hemp, tropical mold, and human labor, was an olfactory signature that represented wealth. A merchant standing in a Batavian 5 inside would have been smelling the future profits of hundreds of shareholders in Amsterdam, the past suffering of thousands of enslaved people in the Banda Islands, and the commerce that was being reorganized on a planetary scale. Every ton of spice represented the death or display of local producers. Every bolt of fine cloth represented a disruption of local trade patterns. Every she-load of goods represented wealth extracted from somewhere and transferred to Amsterdam, to the shareholders, to the financial markets of the Dutch Republic. The VOC was a shipping company first and foremost. Without ships, there would be no trade, no spices, no profits. The company owned and operated an enormous fleet. At its peak, the VOC had somewhere in the vicinity of 150 to 200 active ocean-going ships, though the exact number fluctuated. Over the entire 1970-year history of the company, the VOC commissioned and owned roughly 4,700 ships. That represents an enormous construction effort, a constant replacement of vessels as they aged, rotted, or were lost at sea. The ships were built in the Dutch Republic, primarily in the shipyards of Zaandam and Amsterdam. The Zaandam yards alone were building dozens of ships per year at peak capacity. These were specialized vessels built for long-distance trade. Early VOC ships were simply merchant vessels, often converted from other uses. But over time, the company worked with shipwrights to develop the Vloot, a design that was specifically optimized for long-distance trade. The Vloot was not the fastest ship, it was not the most maneuverable, but it was spacious. It had a large hold relative to the size of the crew. It was relatively easy to build and maintain compared to other ocean-going vessels. The Vloot became the standard cargo ship of the Dutch merchant marine in the 1600s, and it set the template for large merchant vessels for the next century and a half. A typical East Indiaman, the name given to large VOC ships making the voyage to Asia, was perhaps 150 feet long, carried a crew of 200 men, and had a cargo capacity of perhaps 300 tons. The ship itself was a marvel of engineering for the time. Every joint was carefully fitted so that the ship would not spring leaks in heavy seas. The hold was designed to allow air circulation, reducing the risk of rot. The cannons mounted on the deck were both for defense against pirates and for projecting power in territories where the VOC wanted to establish authority. Outfitting a single East Indiaman cost perhaps 40,000 to 60,000 guilders, an enormous sum, equivalent to the total capital that many merchant companies controlled. The VOC, with its vast capital base, could afford to lose a ship here and there and still remain profitable. A small merchant company could not. If you owned a single ship and lost it in a storm, you were ruined. If you owned 5 ships and lost 2, your business likely failed. The VOC owned hundreds, so the loss of a few was calculated into the business plan. This was another source of VOC competitive advantage: capital depth. This was also why the VOC could outcompete smaller merchant ventures, not through superior seamanship or superior trading networks, but simply through the ability to absorb losses that would destroy competitors. The voyage from Amsterdam to Batavia took roughly 8 months. For the first 4 months, the ship would travel south along the African coast, around the Cape of Good Hope, and into the Indian Ocean. For the next 4 months, it would travel east across the Indian Ocean to the Indies, catching the monsoon winds. The conditions aboard ship were miserable. A crew of 300 shared a wooden vessel with no sanitation systems, minimal ventilation, and limited food that was often spoiled by the time it was served. The sailors slept in hammocks strung in the hold. There were no toilets, waste went overboard or was collected in buckets. There was no fresh water, only beer or wine, which was safer than water, but still limited in supply. Approximately 1/3 of the crew typically died on the journey, primarily from scurvy, dysentery, and typhus. A VOC captain knew that of 300 men who departed Amsterdam, perhaps 200 would arrive in Batavia. This was accepted as normal. The company budgeted for this mortality. The wages offered were high enough that there was never a shortage of desperate men willing to make the voyage. The crew was a mixture of volunteers, the unemployed, military deserters, and people escaping legal trouble in the Dutch Republic. The officers, captains, mates, and masters were often experienced sailors who had made multiple voyages. The enlisted men were typically young, often teenagers, and had no sailing experience. They were trained on the job and learned through endurance and observation. Punishment for infractions was severe. A sailor who disobeyed orders could be whipped. Theft was punished with amputation. Desertion was punishable by death, usually by hanging or marooning on a deserted island. The Zienstweet Waits Gendersøstet filmed, Paterned with de Voilubien at A, and for the also Blessebrevens directly counted. But the pay was good. Perhaps 3 times what a labourer could earn in Amsterdam. And for young men with no prospects, the gamble was rational. A soldier returning from a voyage to Asia with accumulated wages could purchase land or open a business. The ships themselves developed legendary reputations. Certain captains were known to keep their crews healthier than others, enforcing standards of cleanliness and rationing. Certain routes became known as less deadly than others. But there was no escaping the basic reality. A voyage to Asia was an ordeal that killed a significant fraction of anyone who undertook it. The return voyage was no less deadly. Ships leaving Batavia were loaded with spices, with skriskas, with cargo, with goods of all sorts. The journey back, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape, and up the coast of Africa, took another 8 months. And the crew, now at half strength because of deaths during the outbound voyage and sickness or desertion in Batavia, faced the same conditions. The voyage was linear. You did not voyage to Asia and back for the sake of the voyage. You undertook the voyage to generate profit. The ship was profit-making machinery. What mattered was that it arrived with its cargo intact. The human cost was externalized. It was not factored into the profit calculations. The mortality was not advertised to recruits. It was simply understood as the cost of doing business. By the 1650s, the VOC had established regular shipping routes. Departure times from Amsterdam were timed to catch seasonal winds. Ships departed in the early spring, time to arrive in Batavia in the autumn, allow time for loading, and depart for Amsterdam in the early winter, arriving back home in the summer. The schedule was as regular as ocean travel allowed. A shareholder in Amsterdam could purchase a share in the VOC with some confidence that ships would depart on schedule, that cargoes would be loaded, that the system would continue. The profits flowed like clockwork, and few asked too many questions about what that clockwork was grinding into powder. While fortunes were being extracted from Asia and concentrated in the hands of VOC shareholders, Amsterdam was transformed. The wealth flowed back to the Dutch Republic, and much of it was spent on visible expressions of status and beauty. A successful merchant could purchase a house in Amsterdam's expanding canal district. These houses were 4 or 5 stories tall, narrow and deep, with large windows, decorated facades, and interior rooms that displayed the owner's wealth and taste. The interiors were filled with furniture, tapestries, paintings, and objects collected from around the world. Chinese porcelain, Japanese lacquerware, Japanese Persian carpets, and Indian cotton lined the interiors of these merchant houses. Every object that notable to wealth and came from distant ships. So these paintings which took its paint from distant houses, club romance for loaves, and these paintings often depicted scenes of wealth, and some paintings from houbles for the families in their homes, where filled with clothes, whip and seasons and stamps. Paintings of intending for the late Zali, the traders of his collection, simply laughed into making for the Nultige, for the Murphy on the shooters and planactions, and if the smoke of the mountains, and we with Mertin could revive thick glasses, aging them, amusement and works, handling and king. Entertainment wealth fueled this argumentus. The painters needed pigments lavim kits Neil from the Americas if they were ultramarine blue from the East, many of which were supplied through VOC trading networks or through the networks that the VOC had established. The result was a positive feedback loop, where spice wealth was converted into art, and the art market created demand for exotic materials, which were supplied by the same trading networks. A single painting might represent the profits from a dozen sheeploads of spices. Rembrandt lived from 1606 to 1669 and was arguably the greatest artist of the Dutch Golden Age. He created paintings and etchings that depicted biblical scenes, historical scenes, and portraits of wealthy patrons who had grown rich through commerce and trade. His paintings captured the aesthetic of the age, a love of light and shadow, of rich textures, of human dignity combined with human suffering. Some of his most celebrated paintings were commissioned by wealthy merchants who had profited from the VOC. A large Rembrandt painting could cost 2,000 or 3,000 guilders, roughly the cost of a year's salary for a highly skilled craftsman, or the annual dividend from a substantial VOC share. The people who could afford to commission such works were the same people who held shares in the VOC, who received dividends, who were investing their wealth in multiple streams of revenue. They were also people who did not have to think about the sources of their wealth in any detailed way. The paintings they commissioned celebrated their status, but said nothing about how that status had been acquired. Amsterdam became, during this period, the richest city in the world. Visiting merchants from Venice, from London, from Hanseatic cities, marveled at the wealth on display, the architecture, the paintings, the goods in the markets. The shops along the main streets offered goods from every part of the known world. An Amsterdam shopper could purchase Japanese swords, Indian spices, Persian carpets, and Chinese tea. The expansion of Amsterdam was visible and tangible. In 1602, when the VOC was chartered, Amsterdam was perhaps 100,000 people. By 1650, it was perhaps 200,000 people. The city was growing faster than the Dutch Republic had ever seen any city grow. The city expanded by building outward, creating the concentric ring of canals, the Heringgracht, the Prinsengracht, the Keizersgracht, that define Amsterdam to the present day. This expansion was funded by profits not just from the VOC but from banking, from insurance, from commodity, from the whole ecosystem of commerce that had developed around the spice trade. The wealthiest merchants were building grand new houses, the middle merchants were investing in smaller properties, and the working classes were finding employment in the services that those wealthier merchants and merchants' families demanded. Within this ecosystem of commerce and art emerged a strange phenomenon: tulip mania. Tulips had been brought to the Netherlands from the Ottoman Empire in the previous century. They were exotic flowers, originally a luxury good, and certain varieties, particularly the striped or flamed varieties with patterns caused by a virus, were rare and sought after by wealthy collectors. By the 1630s, collecting tulips became a form of wealth display and speculation. Tulip bulbs were purchased and sold at auctions, sometimes for extraordinary prices. A single bulb of a particularly rare variety, called the Semper Augustus, could sell for prices that rivaled the purchase price of a modest house in Amsterdam. The phenomenon caught the attention of wealthy merchants, middle-class traders, and even some working people who dreamed of wealth. In the winter of 1636-37, tulip mania reached its peak. Traders were speculating on future tulip prices, purchasing contracts for bulbs that would be delivered after the winter, betting that prices would rise. Prices did rise month after month. But then, in early February 1637, the market collapsed. Suddenly, no one was willing to purchase tulips at the inflated prices. Traders who had committed to purchasing bulbs at high prices found that they could not resell them. The market froze. Buyers disappeared. Some historians have interpreted tulip mania as a bubble, an irrational exuberance that infected the populace and then collapsed catastrophically. Other historians have emphasized that the market was more limited than popular accounts suggest, that it primarily affected wealthy collectors and wealthy merchants, and that the average person did not participate significantly. But tulip mania was undoubtedly an expression of the same fever that drove the spice trade. It was speculation driven by the belief that prices would rise indefinitely. It was wealth seeking a place to invest. It was the mentality of an age that had tasted extraordinary profits and believed that such profits could be found anywhere if you looked hard enough. The collapse of the tulip market was a small warning, a hint that not all investments would prove infinitely profitable, that markets could reverse, that fortunes could evaporate, but the warning went largely unheeded. The VOC continued to pay dividends, the spices continued to arrive, the merchants continued to grow richer, and the system that generated these profits, the system based on monopoly control of some trade routes, monopoly routes, on slavery, on the suppression of local populations, on the extraction of wealth from conquered territories, continued to function as reliably as it had in the past. The paintings created during this era are some of the greatest ever made. They captured a moment when wealth seemed boundless, when beauty could be purchased, when human potential seemed limitless. That these paintings were funded by genocide in distant islands was something that the buyers of the paintings, the patrons who sat for portraits, the viewers who walked through galleries, did not have to think about. The system was structured so that this reality could remain invisible. The VOC was chartered for 21 years. At the end of that period, the charter was renewed, not indefinitely, but for another period of years. Every few decades, the charter was renewed again. This process continued for 170 years. The system worked extraordinarily well for nearly 150 years. Profits flowed regularly to shareholders. The company expanded its operations, established new forts, deepened its monopolies, and generally continued to function as a profit-generating machine. But beginning in the late 1600s, the system began to deteriorate. The deterioration was gradual, and it took a very long time for the company to actually fail, but the trend was unmistakable. Several factors contributed to the decline. The first was competition. The English East India Company, initially less successful than the VOC, gradually improved its operations. By the late 1600s, the English company was beginning to make significant profits. It did not have the monopoly that the VOC had. Few companies did, but it did not need it. The English company could buy and sell spices profitably, could establish trade relationships with regions that the VOC did not fully control, could open new markets for tea and textiles, and could expand into new territories. Trade wars erupted between the Dutch and English, particularly in the Indian Ocean and around the Indonesian archipelago. The VOC attempted to maintain its monopoly through military force, but the English were willing to fight back. These trade wars were expensive, costing enormous amounts in naval vessels, soldiers, and ammunition. The profits that could have been distributed to shareholders were instead diverted to warfare. A ship that could have transported spices was instead outfitted with cannons and sent to destroy English trading posts. The extraordinary returns of the 17th century were displaced by the defensive costs of the 18th century. A second factor was corruption. The further removed the company became from its founding moment, the more pervasive corruption became. VOC officials who were stationed in the Indies would engage in private trading, buying and selling goods for their own account rather than the company's account. This was technically forbidden by company regulation, but it was also ubiquitous and almost impossible to prevent. A governor-general might authorize a ship to sail to a port ostensibly on company business, but the ship would actually be carrying goods owned by the governor-general himself. When the ship returned, the profits went into the governor-general's account rather than the company's account. Governors-general accumulated personal fortunes, sometimes rivaling the size of small kingdoms, while nominally serving the company. The audit structures that were supposed to prevent this were weak and underfunded. The company's accounting systems were so complex and distributed across multiple continents that it was difficult to determine whether money was actually missing or simply misallocated. By the early 1700s, corruption was so widespread that the company's management acknowledged it as a permanent feature of operations rather than something to be prevented or eliminated. A Dutch phrase developed to describe the decline, verringen onder corruptie, literally ruined by corruption. The phrase became almost a joke among merchants in Amsterdam, a shorthand for the visible decay of a once mighty institution, brought down not by external enemies, but by the greed and self-dealing of its own officials. A third factor was structural. The VOC had originally been profitable because it had identified regions where a particular commodity, spice, was produced, established monopoly control, and extracted that commodity at the lowest possible cost. But as the world developed, as European competitors arrived, and as local populations adapted to new market conditions, monopolies became harder to maintain. By the 1700s, the world was producing competing spices. Nutmeg was being grown in the Americas. Cloves were being cultivated in other regions. The VOC's monopoly was no longer as complete or as valuable. The prices that had made the company fabulously wealthy were beginning to fall as supply increased. A fourth factor was organizational. The company had grown so large and so complicated that its internal structures were no longer functional. The Heeren 17th was supposed to govern the company, but the Heeren 17th was composed of representatives from regional chambers, and these representatives often had competing interests. Amsterdam wanted one policy, Middelburg wanted another, Rotterdam wanted a third. Decisions were made by consensus, and consensus was difficult to achieve when the chambers had competing interests. Meanwhile, governors-general in Asia were operating with so much autonomy that they were essentially running independent operations, making decisions that contradicted the stated policies of the Home Office. The company was being pulled in multiple directions simultaneously, and no clear authority had the power to impose unified direction. By the early 1700s, the company had adapted to a state of permanent mediocrity. It was still profitable, profits continued, dividends continued, but the extraordinary profits of the 1600s were gone. Shareholders who purchased VOC shares in 1700 were not receiving the same returns that shareholders who purchased VOC shares in 1602 had received. A share that had paid 20% dividends annually now paid perhaps 5%. The magic was gone. The world had moved on. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, fought between 1780 and 1784, was devastating to the VOC. The English attacked VOC shipping, seized VOC territories, and damaged the company's infrastructure. The English East India Company had become powerful enough to challenge the VOC directly. When the war ended, the VOC had lost significant territory and significant revenue. The company attempted to reorganize, attempted to restructure, but the damage was severe. By 1790, the company was reporting losses rather than profit. Its capital reserves were depleted. It was unable to fund new expeditions or repair damaged facilities. The currency of the Bank of Amsterdam, which had been stable for 180 years and had been the anchor of financial confidence in Europe, lost its premium. Confidence in the company and in Dutch finance more broadly evaporated. In 1796, in the aftermath of the Dutch Republic's military defeats by France, the Dutch government took control of the VOC. The company was reorganized under state control. In 1799, as the charter was about to expire again, the Dutch government chose not to renew it. Instead, the company was formally dissolved on December 31, 1799. The assets were seized by the government of the Batavian Republic. The debts were assumed by the state. The shareholders, who had expected the company to exist forever, who had passed their shares down to their children as if they were landed estates, found that their shares were subject to unclear compensation schemes. Some shareholders received payments, others received nothing. The company that had existed for nearly 200 years, that had seemed permanent and invulnerable, that had been the model for all future corporations, simply ceased to exist. The Dutch East India Company is gone. The ships have rotted into the bottom of oceans. The shareholders have been dead for centuries. The territories that the company controlled have been claimed by independent nations or by other powers. Batavia is now Jakarta, capital of Indonesia, and Batavia's Governor-General's Palace is a historical monument visited by tourists. The warehouses where spices were once stored have been converted into museums or offices. But what the VOC created did not disappear. It evolved and spread and became the template for how the modern world would be organized. The joint stock company, the freely traded share, the stock market, the corporation with limited liability, the idea that capital could be pooled from ordinary people and used to generate profits that would be distributed back to those same people, these are all innovations that the VOC pioneered or refined. Before the VOC, the corporation was a rarity, a specific creation for specific purposes, usually involving a monopoly by the state to accomplish something the state wanted done. After the VOC, the corporation became the default mechanism for organizing large economic enterprises. When the Industrial Revolution began in the late 1700s, the model that was used was the VOC model. Issue shares, pool capital, use that capital to fund large enterprises, extract profits, and distribute them to shareholders. Every modern corporation is, in this sense, a descendant of the VOC. The shareholder mentality, the idea that the purpose of a company is to maximize shareholder returns, is a direct inheritance from the VOC model. The separation between ownership and management, where shareholders own the company but managers operate it, is a VOC innovation. The idea that a company should be structured to maximize short-term returns rather than pursue other objectives, like sustainability or worker welfare, is baked into the corporate structure in a way that traces directly back to the VOC. The VOC also pioneered the use of financial instruments, bonds, forwards contracts, and other derivatives that allowed the company to manage risk and raise capital in creative ways. The speculation and short-selling that occurred on the Amsterdam Beurs established a template for financial markets that continues today. The bubbles and crashes, the irrational exuberance and the sudden reversals are patterns that emerged in the 1600s and have repeated regularly ever since. The language of finance, the concepts, the psychological patterns all descend from that moment in Amsterdam when ordinary people gathered at numbered columns to trade pieces of paper. The Afterhavertenskampermutation, a German with the record in Beischu of Macht, the estimate designs on midst of the artists almost having the internal of mania apage, the early London, upon scanning to meets, they mattled to revive military governmentally records, abatis, neckled pastority cupped institutions, and these are archives internets. In Amsterdam, in The Hague, in Jakarta, in other ports where the VOC maintained offices, these archives are extraordinary. They document one of history's most complex operations, the management of a commercial empire that spanned continents and centuries. They are a roadmap to how early modern commerce actually functioned, not in the abstract, but in concrete detail. Reading through the archives, you can follow the decision-making, the profits and losses, the constant calculations of risk and return. The canal houses of Amsterdam, built with VOC wealth, still stand. Visitors walk along the Prinsengracht, the Heringracht, and the Keizersgracht, and they see houses that were built by merchants who had grown wealthy through the spice trade. Inside these houses are museums. The Anne Frank House, the Rembrandt House, museums dedicated to Amsterdam's history. The beauty of Amsterdam is inseparable from the wealth that flowed back from the Indies. An effort has been made in recent years to historicize this relationship, to acknowledge that the beauty of Amsterdam and the prosperity of the Dutch Golden Age were built on slavery, on genocide, on the monopolistic extraction of wealth from colonized territories. Museum placards now often include brief descriptions of these uncomfortable historical facts. Young visitors stand in front of paintings and can read, if they choose, that the wealthy merchant whose portrait hangs above them had investments in slavery, that the cloth their clothing is made of was woven with wealth extracted from conquered lands. But the aesthetic effect is still there. The canals are still beautiful, the paintings still magnificent. The contradiction is built into the landscape. The Rembrandt paintings that hang in museums around the world are masterpieces that emerged from the financial system that the VOC created. They are products of a system that worked, that generated wealth and beauty, and that also generated systematic suffering across continents. This is perhaps the most important thing that the VOC left behind, not a template for corporate organization, though it did that too. The VOC left behind a model for how wealth and violence can be integrated into a system so smoothly that the people benefiting from the wealth do not have to see the violence. It left behind a template for global capitalism, where production occurs far from consumption, where the violence of extraction is invisible to the consumer, where profits accumulate in distant financial centers, and where the relationship between wealth and suffering is obscured by distance and complexity. When you purchase clothing made in a factory thousands of miles away, you do not have to know the conditions in which it was made. When you own shares in a company, you do not have to know the practices of that company's suppliers. The system that the VOC pioneered learned to make this distance and complexity into a feature rather than a bug. Distance is profit protection. The VOC eventually failed, was dissolved, was forgotten by most of the world. But the system it created survived and spread. It is the system that organizes global commerce today. The ships have rotted, the company is gone, but the architecture of global capitalism that the VOC pioneered continues to shape how the world operates. And perhaps that is the final legacy, not the spices that were extracted, not the profits that were made, not the art that was commissioned. The final legacy is a system that learned how to make wealth seem separate from its sources, how to allow millions of ordinary people to benefit from extraordinary violence without ever having to acknowledge it. The Cold Open described a building in Amsterdam that no longer exists, a columned hall where ordinary citizens purchased shares in a company that did not yet own a ship. That moment was the birth of something new. And what was born was not just a corporation, not just a financial market, not just a system for organizing commerce, for the accumulation of wealth at global scale, and a mechanism for the concealment of the violence that accumulation required. The VOC's charter expired exactly 2 centuries ago. In those 200 years, the corporation has become not just a common form of business organization, but the dominant form. In those 200 years, stock markets have spread from Amsterdam to London to New York to every major city in the world. In those 200 years, the shareholder has become the central figure in capitalism, the person whose interests must be maximized above all others. The modern world is the system the VOC created, functioning, evolved, and spreading. The lights in the bureaus have long gone dark, began to continue, larger and more complex and more thoroughly integrated into global civilization. And the moral distance between the shareholder and the work done in their name remains just as vast as it was in 1620, when a baker in Amsterdam held shares in the company that had emptied the Banda Islands. The system that allows us not to see this remains the greatest invention of the VOC, more important than any ship, any spice, any share certificate. It is the system that allows history to move forward and allows us to move forward with it without having to stop and look too carefully at what pays for the journey.